From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're a longtime fan reliving these monumental events or a newcomer eager to understand wrestling's rich history, you're in the right place. This episode is packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises along the way. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. The lovely Elizabeth. May 12th, 19th, and 26th, and August 11th, 2003. The lovely Elizabeth was one of the most atypical characters in the history of pro wrestling, but the demise of the woman playing the role, Elizabeth Hulette, on May 1st, was sadly far too typical. Hulette, 42, died at Kentstone Hospital in Marietta, Georgia after emergency personnel responded to a 911 call at about 5:30 a.m. saying that she wasn't breathing. Police in the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office will not list a cause of death until toxicology reports come back in a month, other than saying it was likely not a homicide. It is widely believed by those closest to her that she was the latest victim of an overdose, which has claimed so many wrestlers of her generation, although medical examiner Hal Bennett said that is not necessarily the case. Larry Fole, 44, boyfriend best known as Lex Luger, was arrested later that day, not in connection with the death, but because police found large quantities of drugs at the $300,000 townhouse the two shared in Cobb County, just outside of Marietta in suburban Atlanta. Fole was charged with 13 felonies and 1 misdemeanor on drug charges and released on $25,000 bond. He also had 2 other charges, a misdemeanor battery charge on a domestic dispute with Hulette on April 19th, and a DUI after rear-ending a car on April 21st. In recent weeks, the story of 2 people who from the outside seemed to have it all at different times in their lives, and where it went wrong, is hard to ascertain. Hulette was described universally within wrestling as a sweet and beautiful woman, whose sudden and unplanned stardom in the late 1980s never went to her head. At her peak, with the possible exception of Rena Mero as Sable, she was the most popular female performer in the history of the business outside of Japan. In her heyday as the shy, demure Elizabeth from 1985 through 1992 in the WWF, she was the idol and role model to virtually every young girl who watched wrestling, and the first crush of a generation of young television wrestling fans. It was a role not planned for her, nor did anyone expect it to take off the way it did. And ironically, despite the success of the role, no woman in wrestling has ever been put in a similar role, including herself when she returned in a far less effective role with WCW in 1996. Vince McMahon at first tried a similar role for Sable, but that ended up transformed into weekly scenarios to find reasons to get her in as little clothing as possible as a ratings draw, which set the stage for women in pro wrestling since that time. Fole was groomed to be the biggest star in the profession, literally from his first pro match in Florida in late 1985, within weeks of Elizabeth's debut in WWF. At 6'4" and 260 pounds, he was as gifted genetically as any pro wrestler, and was strict enough about training and dieting, as well as everything else that it takes to develop a championship physique to make the most of what he was born with. However, he was not liked by most within the business, since he was recruited into wrestling, and because of his look, always made big money and was a headliner, even though he didn't work hard at improving his craft. He often showed disdain for the business and looked down on so many in it, noting that he never watched wrestling growing up. The first time he was ever at a live wrestling event was the night of his pro debut in Florida, and he was in the main event, and won the Southern title from Wahoo McDaniel right after turning pro. After just 1 year in the business, he signed a $500,000 per year multi-year deal with Jim Crockett Promotions before his first match on the national stage. He was soon put into the Four Horsemen, where the idea is he would learn how to be a franchise player both in and out of the ring from hanging around with Ric Flair. He was supposed to win the title from Flair on 3 different occasions, but Flair refused twice and ended up quitting the company a few weeks prior to the scheduled third one due to a contract dispute. Luger defeated Barry Windham in the main event for the vacant title on July 14, 1991 in a pay-per-view show so bad it became legendary, and spent 8 months as champion during one of the worst periods in company history. While he did drop the title on February 29, 1992, he had all but quit a few months earlier by telling WCW Vice President Kip Frey he was retiring from wrestling to take a $350,000 per year offer from Vince McMahon's World Bodybuilding Federation. For Luger, it was less money, but without the travel and taking bumps. For McMahon, Luger was to be the star that would get the wrestling audience to follow his proposed bodybuilding league, not to mention it being a coup in the wrestling war of signing the reigning world champion from his rival promotion. Frey released him from his contract with the agreement that he would not be part of McMahon's wrestling show. At first, Luger was all over the shows until WCW threatened a lawsuit, and Luger spent the next several months until his WCW contract time had expired on McMahon's low-rated bodybuilding show playing a heel co-host. His WWF tenure started in 1993, after McMahon folded his bodybuilding company and after Hulette had left wrestling. He was brought in as a heel managed by Bobby Heenan, first under the name Narcissus. With that sounding lame, it was changed to the Narcissist, as WWF had the need to create new characters even for people who were known commodities. Eventually those names went by the wayside, and Luger was not the success expected as a heel. However, when McMahon made the decision that Hogan needed to be replaced as the top star a few months later, Luger, although showing no signs of success, was put in the position Crockett had paid him all that money for to be the next Hogan. He was taken off the road and put on the infamous Lex Express bus tour all summer, clad in stars and bars as the newest American hero, stemming from an angle where he turned face by body slamming the 600-pound WWF champion Yokozuna, the late Rodney Onowai, after all the other babyface superstars had failed to do so, and with Yokozuna laughing at the weak Americans. The decision was made to hold off his title win until WrestleMania. He scored a countout win over Yokozuna at the August 30, 1993 SummerSlam to start the build, but he didn't get over as expected. Frustrated, McMahon at one point went to Jerry Jarrett, when he was working there, to have him try and teach Luger tricks to connect with the audience more. Jarrett spoke with Luger, but after 30 minutes, realized it was a lost cause because Luger told him that he was already one of the highest paid guys in the business, never risked his body, and asked what the point was of learning new moves. When WrestleMania 10 was over on March 30, 1994, with the idea that Luger, Yokozuna and Bret Hart would all wrestle twice, the show ended with Hart picked ahead of him to be champion. He faded into a tag team called the Allied Powers with longtime good friend, the late Davey Boy Smith, when he walked out of the company. Wrestlers over the years would note how Luger would laugh at smaller wrestlers working hard to learn new moves, joking that he never had to learn anything more than basic moves, and because of his physique, would always be a bigger star than them. But in recent months, their lives apparently had spiraled out of control. Hulette, who was let go by WCW from her $156,000 per year job just before the company closed up, began working at the front desk of Main Event Fitness in Marietta, Georgia, the gym that Full had owned for years after he and Steve Borden, Sting, opened it during their wrestling heyday. The two had become an item in 1998 while both worked for WCW, at a time when both were married to other people not affiliated with wrestling. Exactly how and why things got the way they did were unclear. Hulette stopped working at the gym months ago. Luger, who hadn't wrestled since WCW closed in March of 2001, and Elizabeth, who hadn't appeared on a wrestling show even longer than that, were both booked on a December 2002 European tour with Andrew McManus World Wrestling All-Stars. It was obvious to those on the tour that things were very wrong. Luger showed up weighing about 305 pounds and was totally immobile. Vince McMahon had hated Luger since he walked out on him with no warning in September 1995, working a house show in Canada on a Sunday night, and showing up in Minneapolis the next night on the first ever Nitro episode, 2. Start a program with Hulk Hogan, a battle of two of wrestling's biggest names for 10 years who had never wrestled before. While it was not a secret Luger was negotiating with WCW, he had told McMahon a week earlier that he was staying. McMahon wanted to sue Luger, but found out from his attorneys that there was a contract loophole and he wouldn't win his suit, which only made him madder at Luger for years. When McMahon bought WCW, he basically made fun of Luger and, in a sense, fired him on the air. Still, Luger believed that McMahon was a physique freak and always equated physique to wrestling stardom, since that was the game he was taught, and he figured McMahon was going to need new stars and couldn't resist a big body. Luger also saw that McMahon had taken back many other people he had claimed at different times he would never use. But WWF showed no interest in him since his reputation in the business was mud from the dying days of WCW. In his last big match on the aptly named Greed pay-per-view on March 18, 2001 in Jacksonville, he and longtime friend Buff Bagwell, upset that they were asked to lose to Sean O'Hare and Chuck Palumbo, simply fell down and laid there to both get pinned in 54 seconds. When more and more old-timers were brought back and Luger never got a call, he must have come to grips that his career as a major player appeared to really be over. NWA TNA was interested in Luger from the start because of his name value, but Luger, who turned down every independent offer that came his way, made it clear from the start he believed working there was beneath his dignity. Worse, while on the tour, he was always sweating. No matter how cold it was, He was blowing up in a minute because of carrying so much weight at his age. It was largely all muscle, although he had lost his freakishly small waist that was the trademark of his physique. He looked to have what is known in bodybuilding circles as GH gut, a distended large stomach, but with ripped abs, which comes with bodybuilders because the overuse of GH has made the internal organs grow so the stomach expands. During the tour he complained so much that nobody could stand him being around except some of the veterans who detached themselves from the situation and looked at it as comedy entertainment. He missed a few shows on the tour due to pneumonia, never leaving his hotel room for days. Still, on the pay-per-view taped on December 6 in Glasgow, Scotland, he was put over Sting for the WWA's world title in terrible match, largely because he was the biggest star who had committed to future tours, something Sting hadn't done. When Sting decided he would come back for future tours and the promotion decided Luger was far too much of a headache, he was asked to drop the title on December 13 in Zurich, Switzerland on the final show of the tour before 2,000 fans. He wouldn't do it clean, even for his longtime friend, so the promotion added Malice and made it a three-way, and Malice was professional enough to do the job for Sting for the switch, in what may end up being the final match of Luger's pro career. As for Elizabeth, even though booked on the tour, she never left her hotel room, except to get on a bus or plane to the next show. Those on the tour said she looked bloated and her behavior worried people, but on that tour there were others, like Luger, who appeared far worse off. Exactly what the root of their problems were is uncertain. While together in WCW, Hulette became like Luger a fitness freak. Those in WCW who spent a lot of time with both said that if Luger had any drug issues outside of the obvious physique drugs, he was able to keep them under wraps in public. When he would travel from Atlanta, he never appeared incoherent on airplanes or anything that would be obvious, even though recreational drug use in that promotion was rampant, shocking even people who came over from ECW. After WCW folded, Luger finally split from wife Peggy. Friends of Hulette said the two were planning on getting married before the end of the year, but both had strangely stopped going to the gym. Several wrestlers who knew him speculated that as vain as he was having a hard time with getting older, not getting the adrenaline rush of being in front of crowds. Even though it was known he never liked wrestling, it was just a job for him that paid him well for years. The first sign of problems, at least to police, came on April 19, when they responded to a call about a fight in the garage of the couple's home. When police arrived, Hulette had 2 black eyes, knots on her forehead, a split lip. She claimed she had fallen down while trying to control the family dog. Police didn't buy it, and arrested Full for misdemeanor battery, and he was released on $2,500 bond. 2 days later, he was arrested on a DUI charge after his 2002 Porsche rear-ended another car near his home. According to the police report, he had slurred speech, bloodshot eyes and couldn't find his driver's license, and police also found a handgun in his car. Hulette, with him at the time, was sent home by police in a taxi. His license had been suspended on March 5 after failing to appear for a court date on charges of driving with expired tags and no proof of insurance. After Hulette's death, although police made clear this was not in connection with the death, he was charged with 14 counts of possession of controlled substances, 13 felonies and 1 misdemeanor. Among the drugs found were hundreds of bottles of various forms of steroids, including testosterone. He had 210 tablets of Dianabol, steroid which is illegal even with a prescription in the U.S. He also had 98 Xanax pills, 5 Vicodins, 361 Carisoprodol tablets, and several other drugs. He was also arrested on a misdemeanor count of possession, sale and distribution of Sizin, a synthetic growth hormone. Hulette's mother, after the death, broke all ties with anyone in the wrestling business, apparently blaming the industry for her daughter's death. Some heard that there wasn't going to be a funeral. Her body was shipped to Kentucky very quickly. Others heard that there was a funeral, but it was being kept secret, and that they specifically didn't want anyone from wrestling knowing about it, or any flowers sent from people in wrestling. Hulette, who was originally from Frankfort, Kentucky, was a teenage wrestling fan who developed a crush on Randy Savage, Randy Poffo. Savage, who was the local world champion for a group called International Championship Wrestling based in nearby Lexington. Savage was as gifted as any wrestler in the business at the time inside the ring, because he had unique intensity, understood ring psychology from growing up in a wrestling family, was a genuine top-notch athlete and although small, had one of the best physiques in the industry. However, the promotion, run by his father Angelo, a former Midwest headliner whose career dated back to the 50s, was known in the trade as an outlaw promotion. That meant they promoted in cities against a local National Wrestling Alliance affiliate. While totally illegal, and in the 50s after a Justice Department investigation, the Alliance promoters had to sign a consent decree that they would not monopolize the business or Blacklist talent. The fact was, that's exactly what they were still doing. And there were two sides to every story, as the Paphos television show would feature the wrestlers, Randy usually being the ringleader, doing promos running down the top stars of both the Jarrett Company as well as the Nick Gulas and Ron Welch, Fuller, NWA promotions. The war was so nasty they even went so far as to have wrestlers on their show, in particular Bob Roop, a well-spoken former Olympic wrestler and Savage, talk about when they worked for the rival promotions, that they would be asked to take dives, and then go on to say, "Nothing like this happens in ICW." They would laugh about how fake Tojo Yamamoto's chops were, make fun that Lawler wore long tights and never even played sports in high school, even to the extent of showing his high school yearbook on television. On occasion, when the Jarrett promotion would run in Louisville or Lexington, the ICW wrestlers would go to the show and cause a commotion. It got so bad that when the Jarrett wrestlers made the weekly trip to Louisville, most were carrying guns. Bill Dundee, Bill Crookshanks, was Jarrett's number 2 babyface, behind Lawler. Savage was routinely make fun of him, because he was about 5'4", on interviews. Savage would go on television and claim he would put up some ridiculous amount of money for a shoot match, 3-on-1, where he'd face Dundee, Jarrett, and Yamamoto. Jarrett was a top babyface in his day because he was a good-looking guy who bled a lot and understood sympathy, but a small, unathletic-looking man. Yamamoto was an even smaller aging local legend who maintained a giant-sized aura because everyone sold for him. There was a confrontation at one point where Crookshanks pulled a gun after Paphos approached him. During the ensuing struggle, Paphos got the gun and hit Crookshanks with it, breaking his jaw, and putting him out of wrestling for months. That was a major embarrassment for the Jarrett side because the Paphos side made sure the word got out. As you can imagine, as great a performer as Savage was, and there were few in his league anywhere, no major promotion would touch him. It was this world that Hulette first saw when she got involved with wrestling. Hulette, who grew up without a father, according to those she confided in later in life, seemed drawn to controlling men. While nobody who knew her had anything negative to say about her personally, it was noted that if her real-life story was ever told, it would make for a fascinating television movie. She started dating Paphos, who was 9 years older than her, went immediately after her divorce to Miami attorney Kerry Lubetsky, for whom she converted to Judaism. She then wound up with Luger, and she became a fitness freak, until both went into a scary decline together in recent months. As an example, when the XWF was formed, they were interested in using Elizabeth. She didn't come because Luger had shamed her into turning down the offer because they hadn't asked him to come in. When she first met Paphos, he was with a woman named Deborah Sotetsky, second-generation woman wrestler Debbie Combs. As the story goes, when he first met her, she was heavy. Feeling she needed to lose weight to get him, she dropped weight, became a knockout, and the two hooked up. In such a small operation, she quickly became part of the family business. She would sell programs at the shows and helped out on office work. By 1983, she was appearing in front of the camera as the pretty face who hosted the local TV shows and introduced the video clips. But the company simply couldn't compete with the popularity of Jarrett's promotion, that ran most of the same cities. Elizabeth and Randy were officially married on December 30, 1984. Eventually, Angelo Paphos called Jerry Jarrett about trying to make money based on what were previously legitimate hostilities. An interpromotional feud of sorts was started by one of the most brilliantly executed angles of the era. It appeared that Savage showed up uninvited and took over the Memphis television show, and it led to a lucrative series of matches with Lawler as the top guns from each company. In Lexington, where fans had seen the feud play out for years, they drew more than 8,000 fans, the biggest crowd in that city in anyone's memory. Memphis drew more than 8,000 for a few weeks as well. While working in the Memphis territory, George Scott, who was the booker for WWF at the time, saw a tape of Savage, and he was brought in, with a major push. Savage had developed such a reputation that McMahon was calling around to people who he knew about him before pulling the trigger on bringing him in. While wrestling at a Memphis television taping on a Saturday morning, Savage got a phone call from Jimmy Hart, who by that time had left Memphis for WWF, and went into the parking lot to talk, and was told they were interested. As talented as Savage was, he had never made big money in wrestling working on outlaw shows. In those days, the heels were brought in, largely to be fed to Hulk Hogan. Savage, while as talented as any, was thought by many at first to be too small as a heel to draw against Hogan, but it ended up being perhaps Hogan's all-time most successful rivalry from the early singles matches that generally did among the best business for any of Hogan's programs. All major heels at the time were also hooked up generally with one of the variety of heel managers, but Savage came in without a manager. They did an angle where all the managers in the promotion were bidding for Savage's services, which only served to make him seem more special than any of the larger but less athletic heels. When the angle played out after several weeks, Savage introduced his manager, and everyone was shocked when an unknown 100-pound woman, all decked out, came to the ring, with announcer Bruno Sammartino being fed the line to surmise that she must be some sort of a movie star. The original idea of Elizabeth was to be a new heel manager. A beautiful woman, but something out of a soap opera, where she would be a hard-nosed business shark. Some will credit Elizabeth with paving the way for the women characters in wrestling, but that would be incorrect. While there were a few woman valets in the 50s, including for top heels like Buddy Rogers, Gorgeous George and the Sheik, for some reason the women in wrestling during the 60s and 70s were wrestlers for the most part. There were a few regional exceptions, like Paul Christie's wife Bunny Love in Indiana or Cowboy Frankie Lane's wife Linda, or Bobby Shane's wife Sherry, but the women were not considered stars on their own as much as accoutrements. The modern-day role of women in wrestling started when Jimmy Garvin took Valerie French, Sunshine, to Texas in 1983. Just about every act that was in Dallas in that year caught fire, and this was no different. Booker Ken Mantell, no relation to Dutch, booked a feud by bringing Garvin's real wife, Patty Williams, in as Precious, turning Sunshine babyface, and she went with Chris Adams. The four feuded, and it caught fire immediately. It became Mantell's booking trademark, having valets feud, although he did it for so long it ran out of steam. Soon, there were women everywhere working as managers, like Missy Hyatt and Nicola Roberts in Texas, Dark Journey in Mid-South, Sherry Martel in the AWA, and on a national basis. Roberts went to Crockett on WTVS as Tully Blanchard's Perfect 10, Baby Doll. WWF wanted in on the trend and made the biggest star of them all, largely because she was portrayed as anything but the typical wrestling woman who dressed as revealing as possible and was portrayed as someone who bounced from male wrestler to male wrestler. Immediately, the original heel plans were dropped. Fans immediately took to her, and the Savage Elizabeth dynamic changed to her portrayed as the most beautiful, elegant, but totally approachable woman. She was a pro wrestling version of Lady Di, with ironically similar real-life storylines and tragic ends. Savage was her heelish, jealous, obsessive and overbearing boyfriend, which ended up having its ironies. There was a famous angle where George Steele, by then late in his career, developed a crush on Elizabeth. While the Savage Steele matches were hardly masterpieces in the ring, having Steele, whose role at the time was of an ugly simple guy who could barely talk, but had this love for this beautiful woman, only made the dynamic stronger. Most beautiful women would have blown this ugly beast off. But she was nice to him. But even though she was just being nice, and showing no romantic affection, her boyfriend would go crazy with jealousy. It was that way when the cameras were off as well. Savage's jealousy was legendary in wrestling. When Savage wasn't watching over her, he would have a road agent or referee or older office person that he trusted with her at all times to make sure none of the boys ever got too close. Savage on occasion chased down and hit fans who tried to touch her as she was walking to and from the ring. Lesser stars were let go by the company for lesser actions involving fans. Her popularity grew, and with the exception of Hogan, the Savage Elizabeth act was the top full-time act in the company very shortly after her 1985 debut. Her character was far more successful than any woman character in wrestling up to that point in time. While Hogan was a superhero that fans were in awe of, she was probably the most liked character in the business at the time. Savage eventually turned babyface by saving Elizabeth, and pro wrestling's royal couple spent a year on top as Savage held the WWF Championship from March 27, 1988 through April 2, 1989. Savage was a babyface through most of that period, before one of the most famous and successful pro wrestling angles ever. Hogan was knocked out of the WWF title tournament with a no contest with Andre the Giant, which Savage won in the finals over Ted DiBiase. Hogan helped in the title win, which ended with Hogan and Savage both hoisting Elizabeth in the air like she was the real champion. The seed for an angle nearly a year later was planted as Hogan was celebrating with Elizabeth, holding her with his hand on her butt, and Savage gave the briefest glare that planted the seed for the WrestleMania main event a year later. When Hogan returned after the making of No Holds Barred, Elizabeth put together Hogan and Savage as the Megapowers, a spoof on the name the Superpowers that Dusty Rhodes had come up with for his tag team with Nikita Koloff at the time. The angle to hook them up was taped for Saturday night's main event on November 11, 1987, airing a few weeks later, when Savage had a singles match with Bret Hart. After winning, Savage was attacked by Honky Tonk Man and Jim Neidhart, along with Hart. Elizabeth ran to the back, and basically dragged Hogan out to make the save, and the two shook hands. At the first ever SummerSlam on August 29, 1988 in Madison Square Garden, the two teamed against Andre the Giant and DiBiase, with heel announcer Jesse Ventura as referee. Most of the pre-match build-up centered around Elizabeth, who by this time was at her peak of popularity. While Elizabeth did pose with Savage doing a bikini poster that was a big seller, she was always dressed up like she was going to a prom whenever she was on television. She was the ultimate homecoming queen who wasn't stuck up, and was nice to the boys who weren't popular. The tease for the match was that if things got bad, Elizabeth, billed as the secret weapon of the megapowers under her fancy clothes, was going to wear a bikini. As it turned out, whether she didn't want to go that far, Savage didn't want it. With the heels in control, Elizabeth got up on the apron, took off her skirt, and the heels were mesmerized by her bikini bottom. Hogan and Savage shook hands like in a cartoon, which wrestling was more like in those days, made their comeback, and of course, won the match. But when 1989 started, to build for the Hogan vs. Savage match, Savage started heeling again, acting more jealous of Hogan's business relationship with Elizabeth. The big angle was shot on February 3, 1989 in Milwaukee during a live prime-time special on NBC. The show drew an 11.6 rating, so it would have been the second most watched pro wrestling television show ever in the US. The Megapowers, actually in only their second major match, wrestled Big Boss Man, who Hogan had been working a program with, and Akeem, who was the one-man gang doing a gimmick where he thought he was black, seriously, who Savage had been defending his title against. It wasn't so much of a match as a few key spots. Spot number 1 was Akeem throwing Savage through the ropes, and he dove out almost like a tope, wiping out Elizabeth. Elizabeth had never been involved physically in action, and took a wild bump from a 235-pound flying out like a missile. She was out cold, and Hogan picked her up and carried her to the back. The next scene was her in this makeshift hospital room. Most of the next 15 minutes on television consisted of Savage being pounded by both men while Elizabeth was unconscious, with the idea that she was seriously injured, and Hogan was crying in the room, begging the doctors to save her life. The skit had one of the most unintentionally funny spots ever, as Elizabeth was no actress, even by wrestling standards, and Hogan was campy on his best days. And this was shot live, which WWE never did in those days except for pay-per-view shows. When they came back from a commercial, and Hogan didn't know they were back, and asked for a TISM time countdown before they would go on, with the whole country watching, and then reverting into the worst overacting, crying and saying, "Doc, please don't let her die," and Randy didn't mean to do it. Finally, in a scene right out of one of the Rocky movies, Liz woke up, and her first words were, "Go help Randy." Hogan ran back to the ring to save Savage. Savage saw him, thinking he had taken Elizabeth, and they both deserted him, and slapped Hogan, and then walked out on Hogan. He wound up in the hospital room, while Hogan was in the ring with both huge heels. While the cameras barely showed any of the match during the 15 minutes where Hogan and Liz were backstage, they did show Hogan left with both men. He made his Superman comeback, pinned Akeem after a leg drop, and then handcuffed Boss Man to manager Slick and ran back to the hospital room. While the acting up to this point had been beyond horrible, Savage made and saved it from there. Savage accused Hogan of being jealous that he was champion and said that Hogan had lusted after Elizabeth. Savage ended up hitting Hogan from behind with the title belt. Elizabeth, now somewhat recovered, screamed and hovered over Hogan to comfort him. Then, in what was a shocking remark at the time, Savage told Elizabeth to get up or he'd splatter her all over the floor, just like Hogan, turning him in one sentence into an incredibly hot heel. They teased that Savage was going to hit Elizabeth with a belt, but they didn't need to do anything close to that. Instead, he grabbed her and threw her hard and went after Hogan. Brutus Beefcake, Hogan's best friend and tag partner at the time, came for the save, but Savage laid him out as well, before storming out. Hogan regained the title from Savage at WrestleMania V on April 2, 1989 in Atlantic City, in a match which, because ticket prices were jacked up at Trump Plaza, drew the largest live gate up to that point in the history of U.S. wrestling. Because more homes had pay-per-view than in 1987 for the Hogan-Andre match, it also broke the all-time record for pay-per-view buys with more than 600,000, and that's with a free TV special on TBS going head-to-head. The estimated $18.90 total revenue gross was the largest wrestling show in history up until that point. The gimmick was that Elizabeth would be at ringside but in a neutral corner, and would make her decision of which guy she was going with at the end of the match. Even though everyone saw Savage as the company's top heel once again, she still saw the good in him. Savage took a bad bump on the outside, but Elizabeth went to help him, but he yelled at her. Later Hogan tried to post Savage, but Elizabeth got in the way. This allowed Savage to post Hogan, but Elizabeth then stopped Savage from attacking Hogan. Savage then ordered Elizabeth to leave ringside, and Hogan came back to win with his foot to the face and leg drop. Elizabeth managed Hogan for a while after Mania, but that dynamic couldn't last for a lot of reasons, and she disappeared from wrestling. In another of those great soap opera moments in wrestling, she returned unadvertised on March 23, 1991, at WrestleMania 7, at the Los Angeles Sports Arena. Savage was wrestling Ultimate Warrior underneath the Hogan Sergeant Slaughter main event, in a loser must retire match. Savage was actually talking about retiring, and both talked about starting a family, something she desperately wanted and never had. Savage, who by this time was being managed by Sherry Martel, had been a heel for years, but it was clear he was going out sympathetically from the start, since he came out wearing a white cowboy hat. Savage put on a show, stealing the card, as he often did, even with it being his first match back after major thumb surgery. Elizabeth was shown at ringside several times during the match, and after Savage lost, Sherry attacked him and put the boots to him. Elizabeth hit the ring for the save, leading to the big closing hug and kiss spot. This was so well done that probably more people were in tears watching this moment than any moment scripted in company history. Well, tears in a good way, anyway. As a babyface Savage, McMahon and Roddy Piper were the three-man announcing team, and most of the summer was spent with McMahon and Piper urging Savage to ask Elizabeth to marry him in the storyline. Savage kept getting cold feet to build the angle, but finally asked. The wedding, billed as the match made in heaven, was actually put in the main event position on the SummerSlam pay-per-view on August 26, 1991 in Madison Square Garden. It was a weird deal, as a lot of the live crowd left, and most of the guys in the crowd didn't care. For women wrestling fans, this was like the event of all events, and again, a lot of women fans in the audience were crying like it was a real wedding. The big angle shot was that Elizabeth after the ceremony opened a wedding present, and a snake came out and scared her to death. This led to Savage coming out of retirement for a feud with Jake Roberts. Later, she was the focal point of her last WWF angle for the semifinal at WrestleMania 8 on April 5, 1992. Ric Flair by this time was WWF champion, and the angle was that he bragged that he was dating Elizabeth before Savage met her. Flair did his incredible promo work, with the repeated tagline, "She was mine before she was yours." Flair and manager Curt Hennig bragged they were going to show a nude photo of Elizabeth on the screen at WrestleMania, which was one of the ultimate bait and switch angles, since it was never even followed up on during the show after being hyped big. Savage regained the title and the royal couple was back on top. But not for long. Stories of Savage being possessive of her were legendary. In the WCW days, Bobby Heenan used to sing the song "How Do You Handle a Hungry Man" from a TV dinner theme song whenever she'd come to talk with him. She had confided to him that when Randy was on the road, he'd buy a TV dinner for every night he was gone, because he never wanted her leaving the house. Another story was in her heyday, when she, Savage, Davey Boy Smith and his then wife Diana were out at a hotel swimming pool on the road. Two very obviously gay men came up to talk to the two women. They just saw her and asked if she was the Elizabeth from television, and she said yes and started talking with them. Savage, who was in the pool, saw it, and gave her a look and said, "Liz, in the pool." She told stories about owning a convertible, but Randy would never let her drive with the top down because he didn't want guys whistling at her. Real life got in the way. Hulette walked out of the relationship that summer, and when she did, with no fanfare, she was gone from the WWF for good. It also caused the real-life rift between Hogan and Savage, which continued for years. Although it settled once when both had the chance to make money with each other in WCW, it is still apparent from Savage's side to this day. Savage blamed Hogan and his wife Linda for urging Elizabeth to leave him, whether true or not. She ended up spending time at their home hiding out when she finally left him. She quickly hooked up with Miami attorney Kerry Lubetsky, who she met at about the same time Hogan was doing the movie Mr. Nanny, in South Florida, and moved there. She went from superstar to nobody in a long relationship, and kept contact with almost nobody in wrestling. Just months after being a major television show, she was working at a retail clothes store as a salesperson at the Aventura Mall, in South Florida, and she became a wrestling trivia question of whatever happened to. Somehow she got the bug in 1995, and made contact with Zane Bresloff, the WCW house show promoter who she, Savage and Gene Okerlund had often traveled with when touring the Rocky Mountain states in the WWF heyday. Bresloff told her to come to Jacksonville to meet the people in charge at WCW. She was then turned down for a job because they thought she was older, didn't look good enough, and there was no place for her. It should be noted that Kevin Sullivan, who was Booker, was at the time trying to get his then-wife, Nancy, back into the company, and there wasn't room for more than one woman by the thought pattern of the time. In fact, one of the ideas floating around was for Nancy to manage Savage and be called the new Elizabeth. However, only a few weeks later, Eric Bischoff decided her return would mean something for ratings, not to mention the various angles that could be done with Savage. Her return on the Clash of Champions on January 23, 1996, her first appearance on television in nearly 4 years, drew a 4.5 rating, which ranked as one of the 3 most watched television wrestling shows in the history of TBS up to that point in time. Her return also gave WCW another piece of bragging rights for signing an ex-WWF superstar. But she was older, and while still very attractive, wrestling had changed, as had she. With a new larger boob job, in a business that was soon to be filled with women performers, she was just another face in the crowd. She worked angles with Savage, which she confided to friends were very difficult. She ended up as a heel with Ric Flair, and later in the NWO with Eric Bischoff. The Flair vs. Savage program in early 1996 with Elizabeth as part of the program was the first sign of life of WCW house shows, just before the company's major business turnaround later in that year. Aside from a match where she botched a finish where she was going to use her high heel shoe as a weapon, which was the laughingstock of wrestling for a week, she was largely just another pretty face in the crowd. She finally married Lubetsky in December of 1997. But her relationship with Luger started soon thereafter. Eventually, they were put together as an act, with her as the manager. Working in the same company as the ex-husband must have added stress, and it was noted by many in the company that when Savage introduced Stephanie Bellers, his latest ex-stripper girlfriend, as Gorgeous George, that suddenly Elizabeth got a bunch of new work done. Her divorce became official in April 1999. During most of her time in WCW, she mainly worked television, and kept a job at another clothes store in South Miami Beach. Luger and Elizabeth were at odds with management often when Vince Russo was in charge. To Russo, a lifelong WWF fan, the one thing left for her was the idea of doing some sort of an angle that would get the famed Elizabeth in her underwear. Something that had never been seen by wrestling fans, some of whom, in Russo's age bracket, would have lusted after her by that point for more than a decade. By this point she was almost 40, and while there is little doubt she wouldn't have wanted to do it, Luger, still a major player, was nixing any idea that called for her to strip or wrestle. Luger was so difficult to deal with that both of them were sent home with pay for a while. When her contract expired just before WCW closed its doors, she was let go, and eventually Luger ended his long marriage. May 19, 2003. The police report filed based on a conversation with Lex Luger, as well as the 911 tape, both indicated that Elizabeth Hulette was mixing vodka and painkillers, sat down to eat, started gurgling, and then died at about 5:30 a.m. on May 1st. The 911 tape, much of which was played on the WWE's television show Confidential on May 10th, saw a totally panicked Luger call saying, "My girlfriend has passed out, and I can't get her to come to. We were eating and she started gurgling. I don't know why. Please send somebody, please." Luger told police Hulette drank about 2 glasses of vodka and took some pills for back pain. While she was sitting on the couch eating some food, she started choking. Luger claimed he picked up some napkins to try and take the food out of her mouth, and started shaking her hoping the food would dislodge, but noticed he wasn't breathing, and in a panic, called 911. Emergency crews arrived 5 minutes later, but she had already turned purple, and was pronounced dead on arrival at Kentstone Hospital in Marietta. Cobb County Police spokesperson Brody Stodd said that the preliminary autopsy report, which was inconclusive about a cause of death, showed no signs of trauma or foul play and that Luger is not considered a suspect in the case. They are awaiting toxicology reports on the death, which is now considered as most likely being due to a bad combination of alcohol and drugs, or of being so loaded from the combination that she lost her eating coordination, choked on the food, and died of asphyxiation. The story grew larger with the police finding more than 1,700 pills, more than 100 bottles and 6 more boxes of steroids, painkillers and GH in the townhouse the two shared in Marietta. According to friends of Luger's, he was handling the situation well considering the circumstances, but he has moved out of the townhouse and is living in a hotel, not wanting to return. Among the drugs found in the home were 18 bottles of the steroid Boldenon, 19 bottles of the steroid Cystanin, which is heavily toxic to the liver, 34 bottles of Primobolan Depot, Enough-Sizin, a growth hormone, to be charged with distribution, 98 Xanax tablets, 210 Dianabol tablets, which would last a hardcore bodybuilder less than 10 days, and 361 Carisoprodol tablets, which should last months, but many wrestlers could go through that in a few weeks. There was a lot of controversy based around the May 10th episode of Confidential, which was one of the most talked about episodes in the history of the show. Many felt it sleazy that from the start of the show, and through every commercial break, they hyped playing a tape of Luger's 911 call, which was saved until the closing moments of the show. Was it a way to try and keep the audience until the end, in a show that has had notable problems, as we've documented weekly, in keeping its audience? Of course it was. But this is not all that unusual in the television news business. To expect a WWE television show which has largely gained a reputation for attempting to rewrite history in their favor to show more ethics than what is regularly done in newscasts competing for ratings is kind of funny to begin with. Many were appalled by playing the 911 call, and while it was unsettling, it was no different than what is also commonplace on newscasts. I heard the Nicole Simpson 911 call after one of the O.J. Simpson beatings so many times on news shows I couldn't even count them. The first half of the episode centered on the television character, which they kept referring to as Miss Elizabeth, in her 1,985 and 92 WWF run. They talked about her vulnerable facial expressions that made the audience empathize with her. The second part, which aired late in the show, covered the news story itself. Many felt it was a hit piece on both Luger and Randy Savage. I strongly disagree. If anything, the facts of her life presented fairly will not reflect positively on either of her wrestling relationships. If you read the story in last week's Observer, with any investigation, they could have gone far harder. I felt if anything, Hulk Hogan was holding back, because the stories of Savage's possessiveness and obsession with Elizabeth were legendary in wrestling during the 80s. Luger's arrest on Easter on battery charges was a matter of public record, and it is part of the story of her life. The fact that she first denied she'd been hit, the Confidential piece brought that up, although it didn't talk about her claiming her bruises were from her dog getting out of control, and refused to press charges also tells part of the story. While some thought it was McMahon's final revenge against Luger for walking out in 1995, and you can speculate motivation for this all day long, the piece never touched on Luger's arrest a few days later for a DUI or his failure to appear a month earlier, since neither was significant to the Elizabeth death, but could have been used to further sully Luger's name. While many within wrestling considered it insanity to bring up all the steroids and GH that were found in their home, it is all a matter of public record, and it was the truth. I myself was stunned at bringing up the distribution charge, but again, I can't understand people for knocking the show for telling the truth on the case. I did think the graphics with the words suicide, homicide, and natural death were unfair. They could justify them because even though there was an early quote used in an Atlanta Journal-Constitution story saying they didn't know if the death was one of those three things, by the time the piece aired, the idea of suicide and homicide were largely ruled out. But the piece itself strongly suggested the death was from a drug overdose. Citing USA Today as its source, the company was careful to acknowledge media outlets as much as combing through and using items from several Atlanta television stations, the local newspaper stories, and the actual police reports. The teases for a second story this coming weekend did come off as more of an attempt at a ratings grab, in an attempt to capitalize what was perceived as the controversy from the first segment. The May 10th show did a 1.1 rating, making it the highest rated episode of Confidential in several months. A correction in the Luger-Elizabeth piece. The uniting of Hogan and Savage actually took place on the October 3, 1987 Saturday Night Main Event. I had it on the November show. It was Savage vs. Honky Tonk Man. Savage delivered the elbow and Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart interfered, which led to the Hart vs. Savage match listed last week. Honky Tonk Man went to hit Savage with his guitar, but Elizabeth got in the way. Honky shoved down Elizabeth, the actual first bump she ever took, then hit Savage with a guitar. Elizabeth ran back and brought back Hogan to make the save. May 26, 2003. Well, I've done nearly 180 on my thoughts from last week regarding the coverage of the Elizabeth Luger situation on WWE television. Even though the segment that did the big number on Confidential on Luger's arrest and speculating on the cause of Elizabeth's death was replayed on SmackDown, it was revolting in the way it was presented the second time. First off, while Confidential is sort of a news story putting company spin and creating fake history, SmackDown is an entertainment show. The way the segment was presented, it made you think they were doing a different type of vignette to build up to bringing Luger in as a heel, not all that different from the Nathan Jones videos before he arrived. Also, the flaws in the piece were far more evident without the updating. The key thing on the first Confidential piece was a cutaway by Gene Okerlund, where he explained the believed circumstances of the death, that Elizabeth was drinking and taking pills, and suddenly stopped breathing, either from the combination or from choking on food she was eating. While a homicide, suicide and natural causes large graphics were a major flaw in the original piece, if you watch the whole thing, you did get something of an idea as to what happened. On SmackDown, all of the Okerlund comments were edited out. The piece itself, in how it was presented, did bring up the USA Today report of a probable overdose, but you more got the impression, since they talked about the death right after the arrest for beating Elizabeth up 2 weeks before her death, that Luger had probably killed her. Within the industry, nearly everyone saw this as McMahon getting back at Luger for walking out on him in 1995. Whether that was coincidental or not, were the SmackDown version, which was replayed on Confidential on May 17th, made for a shoddy presentation as they specifically ignored presenting what are believed to be the real circumstances, and instead presented what came off as an angle to bury Luger, who just the truth alone buried well enough. By airing it on SmackDown and hyping it, it was also clear that from the start, there was no concern about presenting the truth to the viewers as much as an attempt to grab ratings and get Vince McMahon over, which, judging from the reaction from friends of mine who are casual fans, this did nothing of the sort, but they did think Luger killed her because of his comments on the situation. Even worse, all week on WWE television, they hyped Confidential for May 17th with the latest on the story. Instead, they aired the exact same piece, once again without Okerlund talking about what are believed to be the circumstances of death, and just closing with Okerlund saying that attempts to reach Luger for an interview resulted in no returned phone calls, yet another attempt to bury him, and came across as vindictive by this point. August 11, 2020, the Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office ruled that the May 1st death of Elizabeth Hulette, the famed Miss Elizabeth of WWF and WCW fame, was due to a combination overdose of alcohol and pills. Hulette passed away at 5:30 a.m. that morning when she suddenly stopped breathing in an incident that gained widespread publicity on WWE television with features that ran multiple times on Confidential as well as SmackDown, which featured boyfriend and apparent fiancé Larry Foles, Lex Luger, 911 call. Luger reported that Hulette passed out while eating after taking some pills for back pain and 2 glasses of vodka at the home the two were living in, although a later interview with Luger saw him admit she had been taking somas and Lortabs for quite some time before passing out. The toxicology reports on Hulette's body revealed Hulette had a blood alcohol level of 0.299, more than triple the legal limits of 0.08. She also had a mixture of painkillers, nausea medication and tranquilizers in her system. According to Cobb County Medical Examiner's Office forensic investigator Hal Bennett, it was ruled an accidental death, as there were no physical injuries or trauma to her body, other than some healing bruises from a few weeks earlier. Hulette had consumed a large quantity of vodka the night of her death, nearly to the point that she could have died from alcohol poisoning. A 0.35 blood alcohol level is considered fatal. However, she had also dangerous levels of 2 pain-killing drugs, meprobamate and hydrocodone. Both increased the effect of the alcohol. This caused her respiratory system to shut down and her brain to go numb. Large doses of hydrocodone causes numbness of the central nervous system, according to Bennett. Bennett described the death as the equivalent of someone getting drunk and passing out, and then never waking up. She also had significant levels of crisaprotol, somas, and promethazine. Foale was arrested 2 weeks before her death on a misdemeanor battery charge on a domestic dispute with Hulette from April 19. Police responded to a call about a fight in the garage of the couple's home and found Hulette with 2 back eyes, knots on her forehead and a split lip. She claimed it was from falling down when trying to control the family dog. Foale was released on $2,500 bond. That charge has since been dropped as authorities, upon further investigation, believed the arrest was due to an overzealous officer and are now satisfied that it was an unfounded charge. Her family has no animosity or bad feelings toward Lex Luger and how he treated her, said Bennett. Foale was arrested the same day on 13 felony counts of possession of controlled substances, including hundreds of bottles of anabolic steroids as well as Xanax and other painkillers, as well as a misdemeanor count of distribution of dangerous drugs, when they found several boxes of Sizin, a synthetic growth hormone. Those charges are still pending against Foale. It is illegal to possess anabolic steroids in the U.S. unless prescribed by a physician for the treatment of disease. Both possession and prescribing steroids for bodybuilding purposes are felonies after federal laws passed in 1988 and 1991. Foale is also facing a DUI charge after rear-ending a car on April 21. Whether it's the clash of titans in the ring or the drama that unfolds outside it, We're here to break it down, match by match, feud by feud. Remember, in the world of wrestling, every day is a battle, and every victory is a story waiting to be told. Until next time, keep the passion alive, and never stop wrestling with the possibilities. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine.